Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They say the stars whisper, but in this galaxy, they scream. Across the expanse of the Imperium, from the deepest hive cities to the loneliest black ships drifting through void space, the psychic plague burns like a fever no one can cure. Billions of minds cry out in agony, touched by the warp, consumed by visions, mutated beyond recognition. Some beg the Emperor for mercy. Others are torn apart from within before a prayer can even form on their lips. We are taught this is a price, a burden, a punishment for existing in a galaxy gone mad. But what if it isn't? What if the psychic explosion across humanity, this plague of souls, is not an accident at all, but a carefully crafted outcome? The question lies like a dagger in the dark. Did the Emperor create the Psyker plague on purpose? It's a heretical thought, enough to earn a summary execution in the Inquisition's gaze. But heresy has always danced hand in hand with forbidden truths. Maybe, just maybe, this endless suffering is part of something far greater. Something older, deeper, and more terrifying than we've ever dared to consider. The human galaxy did not always tremble at the touch of the warp. Once, long before the Age of Strife, psychic phenomena were rare and unpredictable, more myth than reality. But something changed. A slow bloom of power, invisible but unmistakable, spread like wildfire across the stars. At first it was seen in flashes, minds that could move objects, sense emotions, peer into distant systems. Small miracles, perhaps even gifts. But as centuries passed, these anomalies multiplied, and what was once isolated became epidemic. Humanity, scattered across a million worlds, began to give birth to Psykers in increasing numbers. No world was spared, no bloodline untouched. The warp, that foul mirror of thought and emotion, had always reacted to sentient life. But during the Age of Strife, it seethed into something new. Psychic storms tore apart the void, swallowing ships and systems whole. Empires fell. Civilizations vanished under the weight of uncontrolled psychic awakening. Worlds descended into chaos as demonic possession and madness swept across populations. It was as if the warp itself had become sentient, aware of the growing tide of minds reaching into it. And those minds, untrained and raw, were candles in the wind, drawing predators beyond comprehension. Yet, this plague was not confined to humanity. The Eldar had long suffered from their own fall, a psychic collapse so profound it birthed a god of excess and death. The Orcs, despite their brutish forms, manipulated the warp instinctively through Gestalt belief. Even the Tyranids, monstrous and alien, radiated a silence that choked psychic activity around them. Across every species, the signs were the same. The warp was not only reacting, it was evolving, feeding, expanding. But in humans, the plague took a unique shape. Our psychic outburst did not destroy us outright, it transformed us. Psykers became both the doom and the salvation of the Imperium. Some were conduits of divine will, others ticking time bombs. The emergence of sanctioned Psykers, the Scholastica Psychana, the Librarius, these were answers to a question humanity didn't dare ask out loud. Why now? Why us? Why all at once? Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps the human soul had always been destined to crack open under pressure. But the precision of its timing, its near universal eruption, makes one wonder. Was this simply the result of a chaotic universe aligning its stars in cruelty? Or was someone, guiding it from behind the veil? If you look at the genetic patterns, the inheritance of psychic potential is too consistent to be natural drift. The mutation rate is accelerating. Entire generations are born brimming with latent abilities, even in the most isolated void colonies. On worlds without contact, without warp travel, Psykers still emerge, screaming infants whose dreams summon flame or rip holes in reality. It's not exposure. It's not chance. It's inside them, encoded, waiting. It suggests a deliberate mechanism, a hand shaping the species. And the only being in existence with the knowledge, the reach, and the horrifying will to do so is the Emperor himself. That's where the conspiracy begins to take form. If the Emperor, a being who has lived for untold millennia, wanted to craft a species capable of interfacing with the warp, he would not start suddenly. He would seed it slowly, deliberately. Perhaps through genetics, perhaps through psychic imprinting, or perhaps by simply nurturing the right conditions. War, fear, desperation. All emotional fuels that strengthen warp resonance. Over 10,000 years, even the smallest nudges could trigger a vast cascade, and when it did erupt, the galaxy would never be the same. And there is the terrible beauty of it. A species now tethered to the immaterium like never before. Vulnerable, yes, but also powerful, trainable, usable. The Psyker plague, while devastating, could be the furnace in which humanity's next evolution is forged. Or its final curse. To those who look with eyes unclouded by dogma, the spread of Psykers is not a sickness. It's a design. The timing, the pervasiveness, the genetic echoes, it all points to manipulation. Some may call it divine providence, others, the Emperor's long war. But if he did create this plague, then humanity stands as the product of a grim miracle. Not saved by their god, but altered by their creator. Not victims of chaos, but instruments of a plan so vast it spans time itself. And if that's true, then the real question is not whether the Emperor created the Psyker plague, it's why. Long before the stars were bound by the Imperium, long before Terra burned with the fires of unity and conquest, there was a being who watched from the shadows of human history. The Emperor, ancient, patient, endless. He wore many masks across time, prophet, king, general, silent guardian. But his true face was never seen, not even by those closest to him. He was not a man born of chance or nature. He was a construct of will and knowledge, a fusion of the greatest psychers of early humanity bound into one immortal being. And from the very beginning, he understood something about the warp that no other human could comprehend. To the Emperor, the warp was not just a danger to be contained, it was a force to be understood, shaped, and eventually dominated. He saw what it truly was, a realm of thought and emotion, a shadow of sentient consciousness. While most feared it, and rightly so, the Emperor peered into its heart and saw opportunity. He didn't see the warp as evil. He saw it as a tool, unrefined, volatile, but brimming with potential. Like fire before the first forge, it had to be tamed through structure, sacrifice, and blood. Every decision he made reflects this philosophy. When he emerged during the unification wars on Terra, wielding powers far beyond comprehension, he already knew how to shield himself from the warp's predators. He could walk among daemons and remain untouched. His psychic presence was a fortress, not a gateway. This wasn't just strength, it was mastery. He hadn't simply learned to resist the warp, he had learned to speak its language. But the Emperor did not walk alone in this knowledge. He had rivals, some ancient, like the Chaos Gods themselves, others newer, like the Primordial Annihilator and the entities spawned in the warp's deep past. He knew they would not remain idle. They fed on human emotion, on despair, on the unchecked psychic sparks flaring across mankind. So the Emperor plotted, not only to resist them, but to outpace them, to evolve humanity beyond their grasp. This is where the great contradiction of his plan begins to form. If he feared the warp's influence so deeply, why foster humanity's psychic potential? Why allow the proliferation of minds vulnerable to demonic corruption? Unless, of course, he believed that the only path to true freedom lay through the very heart of the danger itself. Perhaps the Emperor believed that only by embracing the warp could mankind become its master. There are whispers, ancient and often suppressed, that the Emperor interfered with the genetic pathways of early humans, that he laid the foundations of Psyker potential not in recent millennia, but in the dark days before Old Night. Some believe he subtly manipulated the human genome to favor warp receptivity, introducing traits that would, over generations, bloom into psychic sensitivity. It would explain the rapid and uniform rise of Psykers across disconnected worlds. It would suggest a design stretching back tens of thousands of years. He did not merely understand the warp, he sculpted the flow of humanity's future in its image. Even the creation of the Primarchs fits into this narrative. Each of them was a psychic beacon, a reflection of the Emperor's will and essence. Some, like Magnus, were overtly powerful. Others, like Lorgar or the Lion, carried subtler forms of psychic resonance. The Emperor tested different expressions of warp potential through them. Strength, wisdom, loyalty, vision. It was a grand experiment in channeling the warp through controlled vessels. And as history has shown, most of them failed. That failure may not have surprised him. It may have been the point. The Emperor's plan was never about safety. It was about control. His use of the warp wasn't defensive. It was assertive, colonial. He sought to conquer it not with armies, but through a species engineered to dominate it. Humanity was to become not just the rulers of the material galaxy, but the warp as well. And so, when Psykers began to appear en masse, the Emperor did not panic. He created institutions to monitor them, yes, but he also harnessed them, built systems around them, enshrined their importance in imperial doctrine. He sanctioned some, destroyed others, but never stopped the flow. He had no intention of halting the psychic tide. He was riding it. Perhaps he believed that by guiding humanity through this storm, he could burn away the weak and preserve the strong. That through fire, the survivors would emerge as a new species entirely, human in name, but gods in function. Perhaps he saw a time when every human would be a Psyker, shielded by discipline and faith, unified under his eternal will. But such plans come at a cost, and if the Psyker plague was part of his design, then the cost was the suffering of billions. Madness, mutation, death, and demonic ruin. It would mean he saw this pain, anticipated it, and allowed it to unfold, not as a mistake, but as necessity. It is a vision as awe-inspiring as it is terrifying. A god-king who saw the warp not as an enemy, but as destiny. A being who lit the stars with fire and guided his people into the heart of darkness, because only there could they become strong enough to survive. And if this is true, then the Psyker plague is not a curse. It is the Emperor's legacy, written not in stone, but in soul. Among the many enigmas orbiting the Emperor like shattered moons, one name stands as both a mystery and a revelation. Malcador the Sigillite. The Emperor's closest confidant, the bearer of his secrets, and perhaps the only being in the galaxy who ever truly understood the scale of the master of mankind's ambitions. Where others saw an aged advisor cloaked in ancient wisdom, Malcador was in fact the axis around which the Imperium's psychic infrastructure turned. Without him, the Emperor's dreams of harnessing the Psyker plague would have collapsed under their own weight. It was Malcador who first forged the Scholastica Psychana. Malcador who organized the earliest cadres of sanctioned Psykers, filtering them through pain and fire until only the stable, the usable, the obedient remained. He was not merely a bureaucrat or a spymaster. He was the architect of control. And that control was not defensive. It was preparatory. The sanctioned Psyker program is often framed as a reaction to a crisis, but under Malcador's guidance, it became something far more deliberate. Each Psyker was categorized, tested, ranked. Each was trained to contain their power within strict parameters, their minds shackled by blocks, bindings, and mantras. But they were not destroyed. They were preserved, cataloged, positioned like pieces on a board. This was not eradication. It was cultivation. One cannot help but wonder, was Malcador acting solely on the Emperor's orders? Or did he understand something even the Emperor did not? Some speculate that Malcador himself was a Psyker of terrifying magnitude, a being so deeply interwoven with the warp that his presence could smooth the raw edges of reality. Others suggest he was a perpetual like the Emperor and shared a deeper, more ancient role in guiding humanity's fate. Whatever the truth, his fingerprints are found on every psychic institution that emerged in the Imperium. Through Malcador, the Emperor's grip on the Psyker population tightened. Black cells beneath Terra swallowed the unstable. Interrogators peeled apart minds with surgical precision. Astropaths were broken and reforged under the gaze of the Emperor himself, their souls scarred with his divine light. It was control masquerading as salvation. Malcador ensured it all ran with ruthless efficiency. But what if this wasn't a response to chaos? What if it was part of the plan from the beginning? The question arises when one studies how swiftly these systems were erected. The Great Crusade had barely begun when the first sanctioned Psyker units were being fielded. The black ships were already en route to gather the next generation of soul fuel. The Astra Telepathica, the Librarius programs, the orders of the Ordo Hereticus, all these mechanisms appeared fully formed, as if from prophecy. It's as if Malcador had foreseen the psychic explosion and prepared the machinery to harness it well before it became visible to the rest of the galaxy. Perhaps that is the most chilling aspect of it all. Malcador did not resist the Psyker tide. He shepherded it. With calm detachment, he selected which minds would serve and which would die. And always, behind his decisions, loomed the greater design, the Emperor's golden dream of a psychic humanity bound together not by blood or faith, but by power and control. Some within the High Lords whispered that Malcador was too close to the warp, too comfortable with its touch. But none dared challenge him. His authority was absolute, sanctioned not only by the Emperor's will but by his results. He didn't just protect the Imperium from psychic disaster. He transformed it into a weaponized ecosystem of psychic dominance. Every soul harvested, every mind broken and rebuilt, became another cog in a machine designed to interface with the Immaterium on humanity's terms. And when the hour grew darkest, when the Emperor fell beneath the blade of Horus, Malcador took his place on the Golden Throne. Not as a placeholder, but as a final proof. He burned his soul to keep the warp open for the Emperor's project. He died not as a martyr, but as a keystone. Without him, the plan would have shattered. In the end, Malcador's legacy is one of paradox. He was a protector of humanity, and also its silent executioner. He stood at the Emperor's side, yet may have known more than the Emperor himself. If the Psyker plague was seeded by design, then Malcador was its gardener, pruning and shaping it into something that could grow into the future. And yet, as the screams of harvested Psykers echo across the void, one must ask, what kind of future demands this much suffering to succeed? If the sanctioned Psyker program was preparation, then what horror were they preparing us to face? Or worse, what horror were they preparing us to become? Across the star-scarred span of the galaxy, the Great Crusade is remembered as a holy march, a surge of fire and banners across the void, humanity reclaiming its birthright from the darkness of old night. Billions were liberated, worlds were brought to heal. The Primarchs shone like demigods, and the Emperor stood at the helm, invincible and righteous. But beneath the banners and the triumphs, beneath the glories etched into the annals of imperial truth, there lies a quieter purpose, one rarely spoken of, but no less vital. The Great Crusade was not just a war of conquest, it was a war of collection. Look closer and patterns begin to emerge. Entire systems deemed unworthy of military attention were still visited by imperial scholars, inquisitors, and black-armored operatives. Cultures with known psychic anomalies, especially those showing signs of stable or ritualized Psyker usage, were quietly subdued and harvested. Populations of latent Psykers, often undetected by local authorities, were catalogued and relocated. These actions were rarely recorded in standard Crusade archives, but they happened again and again. Consider the worlds of the Segmentum Obscurus, where entire continents were declared cleansed, despite lacking major Xenos resistance, or the strange silence that followed contact with the Pale Light Cluster, where Psyker birth rates were off the charts and every firstborn child reportedly dreamed of burning suns. These places were not simply conquered, they were studied, picked apart, assimilated into a psychic map that only the Emperor and his closest agents understood. Even the compliance structures of the Crusades seemed to reflect this hidden agenda. There was an almost obsessive need to secure and stabilize warp routes, not just for logistics, but for spiritual analysis. Astropaths were seeded like seeds in the wind, opening invisible channels across the stars. Librarius programs were quietly reintroduced on certain fronts, even before their formal approval. Rogue Psykers captured in battle were not always executed. They were taken away, deep into ships that never re-emerged, or sent to facilities that do not exist on any star chart. What if the Crusade was not only about unity, but about finding the right pieces to a puzzle the Emperor had been assembling for millennia? What if every world touched was a variable in a grand psychic equation? And what better way to gather data than through war? The trauma of battle, the psychic emissions of mass death, the flare of emotion in planetary conquest, all of these are warp-conductive phenomena. The Emperor, with his unmatched perception, could have been watching the warp resonate through these events, taking notes, adjusting his strategy. Each campaign became a test of humanity's psychic tolerance. Each compliance, a measurement of resistance and adaptation. It was a crucible. The Primarchs themselves may have been placed with this in mind. Their assignments were not random. Magnus, the most overt Psyker, was sent to Prospero, a world of esoteric learning and hidden truths. Lorgar, ever drawn to spiritual matters, was sent into cultures ripe with belief and warp reverence. Even Vulcan, so averse to psychic intrusion, was placed on a death world where survival instincts could mirror psychic resistance. These weren't accidents, they were diagnostics. There is another layer, darker still. The Exodite worlds, the ghost planets of the Eldar. the Forgotten Moons where warp echoes rang louder than any Vox transmission. These were visited not for conquest, but for study. It is known that some Terran ships entered these systems and never returned. Their crews burned out not by battle, but by exposure. Why would the Imperium risk elite assets on missions that offered no strategic gain? Unless those missions were seeking something. Traces, footprints, psychic signatures. Perhaps the Emperor was mapping the warp itself, using the Crusade not just to reclaim space, but to thread a network of psychic nodes. A lattice through which human psychic energy could be channeled, regulated, and eventually ignited. The black ships, which we associate with later periods, have roots in this time. Unmarked vessels, their origins cloaked in secrecy, began to appear in the Crusade's wake. Not in publicized triumphs, but in quiet aftermaths, places where Psyker activity had been documented. These ships did not ferry troops, they harvested souls. In this light, the Great Crusade becomes something far more disturbing. Not a march of liberation, but a culling, a harvest. A search for pieces in a puzzle only the Emperor could see. Psykers were not merely tolerated or eliminated. They were measured, indexed, and stored like data in a vault. Perhaps that is the true heresy. Not that the Emperor failed to foresee the Psyker plague, but that he orchestrated the conditions for it to flourish, under the cover of war, beneath the banners of unity. If so, then every screaming world, every warp breach, every burning soul might not be an accident of fate. It might be the product of design. The Librarius was not supposed to exist, at least not in the form it took during the Great Crusade. At first, it was a daring experiment, one that tiptoed along the razor's edge between enlightenment and heresy. Space Marine librarians, those towering demigods of war, wielding not only bolters and blades but psychic might, were a revelation and a warning, for in them was the culmination of the Emperor's hidden vision, the fusion of psychic power and absolute loyalty. Yet even as they burned with righteous fury, they ignited a firestorm of debate that threatened to tear the Imperium apart. The Council of Nicaea was not just a judgment, it was a reckoning. To understand its weight, we must go back to when the Librarius was founded. Initially sanctioned with quiet approval, librarians were drawn from the ranks of Astartes, who showed psychic potential. These warriors were trained not only in martial technique, but in the ways of the warp, disciplined, conditioned, and formed into weapons more terrifying than any tank or titan. They became living psychic batteries, their minds tempered by imperial doctrine and war-born discipline. But not all welcomed this new breed. Many Primarchs recoiled at the very concept. Russ, ever the savage hound, saw witchcraft in every glimmer of psychic light. Dorn, iron-willed and pragmatic, believed it was a dangerous distraction. Even Corax, whose own legion harbored secrets, voiced concern over the volatility of such power. To them, the Librarius was a blasphemy wearing armor, a gateway to damnation. The defenders of the program, led by Magnus the Red, argued the opposite. They believed psychic power was humanity's next step, its evolutionary inheritance. Denying it was not safety, it was stagnation. Magnus saw himself and his legion as teachers, guides, shepherds of a future where mankind would finally rise to meet the warp on its own terms. But in his pride, he underestimated just how deeply the scars of the old night still festered. The Emperor had permitted the Librarius. Of that there is little doubt. Whether it was a test, a trap, or a calculated maneuver remains uncertain. But when the psychic tide rose too high, when reports of uncontrolled manifestations and whispered demonic incursions began to surface, the Council of Nicaea was convened, a gathering of gods, a court of power beyond mortal comprehension. And in that chamber of titans, the fate of human psychic potential hung in the balance. The Emperor's verdict was clear. The use of psychic powers by Astartes was henceforth forbidden. The Librarius was to be dismantled. Magnus's dream was shattered. The other Primarchs, many of whom had feared this moment, exhaled in relief. Order, it seemed, had been restored. But why would the Emperor allow the program only to crush it? Why raise the specter of psychic unity only to cast it down in public spectacle? Perhaps it was never about success. Perhaps the Librarius was a stress test. A controlled detonation to see how much psychic instability the Imperium could endure before fracturing. Or perhaps it was bait, designed to expose the deepest allegiances and suspicions of the Primarchs. After all, those who supported psychic warfare revealed their openness to warp manipulation. Those who opposed it revealed their fears. From the ashes of the debate, the emperor could take full measure of his sons and know who could be trusted with power and who must be broken. And yet, even after Nicaea, the psychic plague did not cease. Untrained psychers still erupted across the galaxy. Demonic incursions still tore through the veil. The Librarius was gone, but the warp had not been cowed. If anything, it grew stronger. The suppression of psychic expression may have only concentrated the pressure, like a sealed boiler about to burst. In this sense, the Emperor's decree may not have been a retreat, but a recalibration, a pause before the next phase of his plan. Perhaps he needed time to build the black ships, time to finish the webway, time to prepare the next generation of tools. The Council of Nicaea, then, becomes not a rejection of psychic evolution, but a delay, a sacrifice made to preserve the larger vision. One world burns to save the star. But to those who lived through it, to those whose dreams were outlawed and whose minds were silenced, Nicaea was a betrayal. It was a denial of truth, a commandment etched in fear. And for Magnus, it was the spark that would ignite the heresy. If the Emperor truly engineered the rise of Psykers, then Nicaea was never about safety, it was about control. A message to the galaxy that no power, no matter how divine or gifted, would rise above the Imperium's absolute authority. The Psyker plague could be tolerated, cultivated, but never celebrated, never trusted. And so the paradox deepens, a galaxy swelling with psychic potential, crushed under laws that forbid its expression. A ruler who cedes power, then punishes those who use it. A dream built on fire, drowned in silence. All part of a design so vast we may never know whether it was brilliance or madness. In the subterranean depths beneath the imperial palace, far from the eyes of primarchs, generals, or even the high lords, a secret took form. Vast, arcane, and dangerous beyond comprehension. The Webway Project, its official narrative was simple. The Emperor sought a way to free humanity from dependence on the warp for travel, to build a labyrinth of safe paths connecting every star in the Imperium without risking demonic intrusion. A noble ambition, a godlike dream. But as always with the Emperor, what was said and what was intended may not have been the same. The Webway was not just a means of movement. It was a crucible of psychic experimentation. Hidden in its glowing corridors, the Emperor labored to build a bridge between the material and immaterial, a lattice of control through which he could guide not only ships, but souls. Or if humanity was to become a race of Psykers, unchained and united, then they would need more than just training. They would need infrastructure, psychic infrastructure. Beneath the guise of a transit system, the Webway Project was perhaps something closer to a warp control grid, a galactic nervous system for the psychic evolution he had long cultivated. The Emperor had studied the Eldar, seen their empire rise and fall within their own Webway, and understood its potential. But where the Eldar had been consumed by decadence, he believed humanity could be honed into something harder, more disciplined. The Webway would not be a playground, it would be a throne. And then, Magnus shattered it. When the Crimson King tore through the veil to warn his father of Horus's betrayal, he did not merely crack open a door. He smashed through the gate of the secret labyrinth, allowing the daemons of the warp to pour into the Emperor's sanctum. The Webway, already fragile and unstable, was flooded with corruption. A psychic war erupted in the shadows of reality, with the Emperor himself forced to abandon all other duties to contain the breach. It was a failure. A tragedy, a catastrophe that doomed his grand design. But what if it wasn't? What if the Webway Project, like the Librarius before it, was never meant to succeed in the way it was publicly understood? What if Magnus's betrayal was not an accident, but an inevitability engineered from the beginning? Consider the possibility that the Emperor allowed Magnus to believe he was acting in secret, even as he subtly opened paths that would guide his son to the fated moment. After all, who but the Emperor could construct a system so delicate and then leave it vulnerable to precisely the kind of warp intrusion Magnus represented? If so, then Magnus may have been more than a son. He may have been a sacrifice. The idea is horrific but compelling. The Webway breach forced the Emperor to the Golden Throne, binding him forever in stasis. This position, while tragic, gave him absolute psychic control over a portion of the warp. It turned the throne into a psychic fulcrum, anchoring not just the Astronomicon, but the very soul-harvesting machinery of the Imperium. Without the breach, he might never have assumed that position. Without Magnus's mistake, the Emperor's presence might have remained scattered, diluted, distracted. Now he is everywhere. Watching, burning, consuming. This leads to a darker interpretation, that the Emperor designed the Webway project not as a gift but as a trigger. A psychic honeypot to draw out chaos, expose the unreliability of even the most powerful Psykers, and force the Imperium into a state of constant spiritual discipline. In essence, a self-inflicted psychic wound to harden the species against future trauma. It also reframed Psykers, not as soldiers, but as currency. Every Psyker who burns on the Golden Throne, every soul tithe collected by the Black Ships, becomes part of this machinery. The Webway was never about safe passage. It was about feeding the throne. About constructing a singular point of psychic gravity where the Emperor could reshape humanity's evolution through control, sacrifice, and fire. The fact that it failed only enhances the theory, because from that failure came the modern Imperium, a system in which Psykers are simultaneously necessary and feared, where warp navigation requires a soul-burning beacon, and where humanity is forced into a relentless cycle of harvesting, consuming, and sacrificing its own to keep the dream alive. And this cycle may be exactly what the Emperor intended. Was the Webway meant to fail so that something far more permanent, far more controlling, could be born from its ashes? Did Magnus play his role not in spite of his father's will, but because of it? There are no definitive answers, only shadows. But one thing is clear, the Webway was never just a corridor. It was a psychic battlefield, a divine experiment, and perhaps the final step in a plan that stretched across time itself. Whether it was a trap for chaos or a trap for humanity, we may never know. But we are still walking through its aftermath. Every day, every scream aboard the Black Ships, every flare of the Astronomicon. The Webway was never sealed, it was transformed. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Cyclopean Sun, his name echoes through history like a tragic chord, resonant with sorrow, fury, and betrayal. To many, he is the architect of the Imperium's downfall, the Primarch whose arrogance shattered the Emperor's secret Webway project and forced the Golden Throne into unending operation. But to those who peer beneath the surface of Imperial dogma, Magnus appears not as a villain, but as a victim. Or more chillingly, as a chosen piece in a cosmic game played by the Emperor himself. From the moment of his creation, Magnus was unlike his brothers. A psychic colossus, his mind burned with warp flame from birth. He did not merely channel power, he embodied it. While others raised legions, conquered worlds, or enforced order, Magnus sought knowledge. He was a student of the universe, a reader of forbidden truths, and a philosopher of the soul. And he loved his father, not with the blind obedience of a weapon, but with the intellectual devotion of a mind yearning to be understood. But that love was never truly returned. The Emperor saw Magnus's power. He harnessed it, encouraged it in silence, then condemned it in public. He allowed the Thousand Sons to pursue arcane studies, permitted the formation of the Librarius, and even walked alongside Magnus in psychic communion. Yet at Nicaea he silenced him, cast him down, branded his very essence as heresy. Why? The surface answer is simple. Magnus became too dangerous, too reckless. But deeper analysis reveals something far more calculated. If the Emperor had always intended to channel the psychic potential of mankind, he needed a fulcrum, an event that would shock the galaxy into accepting the necessary authoritarian control over Psykers. An event like Magnus's fall. Magnus was too powerful to be ignored, too gifted to be left alone. But he was also too emotional, too compassionate, too questioning. He was not the tool the Emperor wanted. So he became the trigger. The trap was set the moment the Emperor told Magnus not to use his powers to warn of Horus's corruption. He knew Magnus would not obey. He knew his son's heart too well. By placing a seal on the psychic path, the Emperor created a locked door, and Magnus, driven by loyalty and desperation, broke it down. The damage was catastrophic, but perhaps it was always meant to be. If the Webway was a psychic engine, then Magnus's breach was the ignition spark. It forced the Emperor onto the throne, transformed the Imperium into a war-fueled Psyker harvesting state and justified the existence of soul tithe, black ships, and the endless torment of sanctioned Psykers. Without Magnus, there would be no Crisis. And without Crisis, there would be no Imperium as we know it. Magnus's tragedy becomes even more profound when viewed through this lens. He was not simply betrayed, he was used. His every strength became a vulnerability to be exploited. His hunger for knowledge made him susceptible to warp corruption. His loyalty made him predictable. His fall, rather than a mistake, becomes a design, one orchestrated by the very father he worshipped. There are whispers, even among the Thousand Sons, that the Emperor could have stopped Magnus at any moment, that he saw the ripples in the warp before they crashed, that he allowed Prospero to burn, allowed Rust to become the executioner, allowed his son to fall into the arms of Tzeentch because it was necessary. Magnus, then, becomes a symbol, not just of the danger of psychic arrogance, but of the Emperor's cold, unflinching calculus, a being who would sacrifice his own children to shape the future. A being who would ignite the heresy if it meant forging a more resilient species from the ashes. The greatest horror of Magnus's story is not his fall. It is the possibility that he was never meant to remain loyal, that his corruption was foreseen, even required, that the Emperor, in all his brilliance, did not mourn the Cyclops' descent, but counted on it. And what does that say about the Emperor's vision for humanity? If Magnus was a sacrificial lamb, offered up to teach the Imperium how to fear and control the warp, then every Psyker burned in his wake is part of that lesson. Every soul devoured by the black ships, every whispering astropath driven mad by demonic voices, all of it stems from one moment, one warning, one scream through the warp. I have seen your fate, Father. Maybe he had. Maybe Magnus, in his doomed brilliance, saw the truth before any of us. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he had to fall. They are the shadows of salvation and the scent of dread. When the black ships arrive, no songs are sung, no banners wave. They glide silently into orbit, dark titans against the stars, and when they leave, entire populations are forever changed. These vessels are not warships. They do not carry soldiers or saints. They carry harvesters, agents of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and they have come for the Psykers. The existence of the black ships is one of the Imperium's most open secrets, and yet few dare to speak of what they do. On each world, they arrive with cold precision, gathering the mutants, the cursed, the gifted, any who show the slightest sign of psychic awakening. From shrieking infants to babbling elders, from powerful sorcerers to terrified innocents, all are taken. It is called the soul tithe, a grim necessity, they say, a divine tax to fuel the Astronomicon. But that phrase is a lie of comfort. It is not a tithe, it is a harvest. For every Psyker taken aboard, fewer than 1 in 100 will ever serve the Imperium. The rest are fed to the Golden Throne, burned away to keep the Emperor's light alive. Their minds crushed, their souls consumed, an endless sacrifice to sustain the psychic lighthouse that guides ships through the void. The cost is incalculable, and it never ends, and still the black ships come. But what if this system, this monstrous engine of sacrifice, was not born of desperation? What if it was part of the Emperor's original vision? Let us consider this. The timing of the black ship's emergence. They were not an invention of panic after the heresy. They were prepared in advance. The Astra Telepathica, the training facilities, the classifications of psychic levels, all were created rapidly and efficiently, as if the bureaucracy had already been written. As if someone had planned it long before the crisis began. The Emperor knew Psykers would rise. He designed the institutions to manage them before the outbreak reached critical mass. That much is evident. But what if he intended for them to rise in such numbers? What if he seeded the conditions that would necessitate the creation of this soul harvesting machine? If so, the black ships are not a response. They are fulfillment. Proof that the psychic explosion of humanity was not an accident, but a resource to be mined. There is a sinister symmetry to the system. The Imperium births Psykers at a terrifying rate. The black ships gather them. The weak are burned. The strong are indoctrinated, leashed, and deployed. And the Emperor, enthroned in death, yet psychically omnipresent, feeds on their souls. Whether to survive, to dream, or to direct the Astronomicon, he consumes them. Every day, every hour. The horror is not that this happens. The horror is that it works. Without the black ships, warp travel fails. Without Psyker sacrifice, the Astronomicon goes dark. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium collapses. Billions die, so trillions may live. It is efficient, ruthless, imperial. But was it ever meant to be temporary? There are those who believe the Emperor intended to move beyond the throne, that the Golden Throne was a stopgap, a bridge toward a brighter future. But what if it was always the destination? What if the throne was the culmination of his psychic architecture and the black ships its blood vessels? A galactic circulatory system built not to end, but to endure? If so, then the Psyker plague becomes not a mistake, but a fuel source, a renewable one, a perpetual harvest, a system in which suffering is not a consequence, but a requirement. This changes everything. The black ships are no longer silent shepherds of necessity. They are proof of a grand design, one that treats human souls as currency, Psyker potential as capital. And the Emperor, seated in his radiant tomb, is the banker, the master of a cosmic economy built on pain. To live in the Imperium is to live under the gaze of this machine, to know that psychic birth is a death sentence, that every miracle comes with a cost, that the Emperor's dream was never peace, it was control. And in that control lies the most chilling truth. Perhaps the Emperor did not want to cure the Psyker plague. Perhaps he wanted to master it, to ensure that no power, demonic, Xenos, or human, could rise without his blessing. The black ships enforce that doctrine. They are not merely tools. They are the Emperor's will made manifest. In the frozen silence of deep space, where the stars themselves seem to hold their breath, an alien horror stirs, a hunger older than history, deeper than language. The Tyranids. They do not come to conquer. They do not come to enslave. They come to consume. Entire worlds vanish beneath their tides. Ecosystems are stripped to bone. And yet, their most terrifying weapon is not their claws or biomass, but the silence they carry with them, the shadow in the warp. To human psychers, this silence is not peaceful. It is suffocating. It is a psychic null zone, a soul-smothering fog that cuts off connection to the warp. Astropaths go blind. Navigators scream and bleed from their third eyes. Sanctioned psychers writhe in agony as their lifeline to the warp is severed. Entire fleets go dark. Planets become isolated tombs, unable to call for help. This is not simple disruption. It is psychic annihilation, a deadening of the very substance from which psychers draw breath. And it forces us to ask, did the Emperor see this coming? The Tyranids arrived in the galaxy long after the heresy, or so we are told. But there are anomalies, ancient reports of entire systems disappearing in patterns that do not match chaos incursions. Ghost ships found adrift with their crews shredded from the inside, but no sign of demonic taint. And the Emperor, whose mind stretched across probabilities and timelines, who saw beyond the veil of the present, may have known, may have foreseen, may have planned. What if the Psyker plague was not just a response to chaos, but a preemptive defense against the Tyranids? Consider the architecture of humanity's psychic network. The Astronomicon, powered by thousands of psychers, sends out a psychic beacon across the stars. The Librarius, the Astra Telepathica, the sanctioned psychers, all of it weaves a lattice of warp activity, not just for communication or travel, but for presence, for assertion. It is a statement to the galaxy. This is humanity's domain. This is our psychic footprint. But against the Tyranids, presence alone is not enough. Their shadow doesn't fight. It smothers. And only those trained to resist, to hold on to their sense of self when the warp disappears, can survive it. Who better to develop such resistance than psychers forced to endure the soul-grinding torment of the black ships? Who better to train for silence than those who've been taught to scream without sound? Perhaps the Emperor created a crucible, a galactic training program hidden beneath layers of religion and war, to forge psychers capable of surviving the Tyranid void. Perhaps the horror of the psychic harvest was not just fuel for the throne, but preparation for an enemy that makes daemons look merciful. There is another possibility, darker still. The Tyranids may have been drawn to the galaxy not by chance, but by signal. A psychic beacon burning brighter than 1,000 suns, the Astronomicon, the Emperor's light. What if, in creating a galactic warp lighthouse, the Emperor also rang a dinner bell across the stars? It is a terrifying paradox. The light that guides also attracts. The Emperor, in trying to unify and protect humanity through psychic infrastructure, may have also exposed it to the greatest predator in the cosmos. And yet, if this is true, it may not have been a miscalculation. It may have been bait. The Tyranids, for all their horror, are not daemons. They are not warp-born. They do not twist souls or tempt hearts. They consume, they reduce. And in that reduction lies an opportunity. For a species like humanity, saturated in warp energy, fracturing under the weight of uncontrolled psychers and demonic threat, the Tyranids offer a clarifying pressure. An enemy that cannot be corrupted, only fought. If the Emperor seeded the Psyker plague, it may have been to build a species that could generate enough psychic power to repel the shadow, or perhaps to bait the hive mind into revealing itself, to draw it in, to study it, to find a way to break it. Because in the cold calculus of the Emperor's mind, no cost is too high, not if it leads to victory. And so the Psyker plague becomes more than a mutation. It becomes a weapon, a signal, a shield, a scream into the void that says, "Come and test us." The Tyranids heard that scream, and now they are here. The Golden Throne. At first glance, it is a life support device, a psychic amplifier, a glorified tomb. But as with all things built by the Emperor, its true purpose may run far deeper. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, this arcane mechanism pulses with unimaginable energy. It does not simply keep the Emperor alive. It channels, focuses, and transforms psychic force on a scale that defies logic. The throne is not just a prison. It is an engine, a weapon, a throne in the truest sense of power. Its creation predates the heresy. Indeed, it predates even the Great Crusade. Ancient records suggest that construction began during the Unification Wars, hidden beneath the mountains of Terra long before the Imperium took shape. The Emperor called it a means of accessing the webway, a psychic gateway, safer than warp travel, immune to demonic corruption. That was the explanation. But even then, there were hints of another purpose, one that required not just advanced technology but human souls. The throne's architecture is not entirely Terran. Elements of it bear resemblance to Eldar constructs, specifically the circuitry of the webway portals. Other components suggest reverse-engineered Necron principles, phase-locked fields, soul entrapment nodes, null gravity chambers. The Emperor took pieces from every ancient race, every lost age, and fused them into something utterly unique. Something alive. When Magnus shattered the veil and daemons poured into the webway, the Emperor made the ultimate sacrifice. He allowed himself to be interred within the throne, his body broken, his mind flayed open across the warp. In doing so, he sealed the breach and lit the Astronomicon. This act, noble as it was also an activation. The throne was never meant to simply be sat upon, it was meant to be inhabited. And once the Emperor entered it, something changed. The throne became more than a life support machine. It became a node through which thousands of Psyker souls are funneled every day. A conduit of warp energy, a constant storm of thought, sacrifice, and raw power. The pain of the tithed, the screams of the consumed, the channeling of the Astronomicon, all of it flows into the throne. And from it, the Emperor's presence radiates across the galaxy. This system is not reactive, it is proactive. The throne regulates the warp flow across sectors, it stabilizes warp lanes, it generates psychic pressure. Some believe it even acts as a beacon that repels demonic incursions, not by closing the Eye of Terror, but by saturating the galaxy with Imperial psychic dominance. It's like a sun in the immaterium, burning away shadows not with light, but with sovereignty. And herein lies the deeper question. Was this always the plan? The Golden Throne may not have been built to preserve the Emperor. It may have been built to transform him, to elevate him from a man of flesh to a god of soul. A being who can control the evolution of psychic humanity, not with words or laws, but with will alone. The fact that it requires constant sacrifice is not a flaw. It is the cost of operation. The Psyker plague, then, becomes the fuel. A distributed network of psychic generators, human lives, collected and fed into the throne to keep the engine running. Each soul, as it burns, is not lost, it is converted. Used to bolster the Emperor's power, expand his awareness, and enforce the psychic geometry of his Imperium. Some whisper that the throne allows him to shape the warp itself, that faith in the Emperor, when strong enough, manifests real power, that miracles on battlefields are not coincidences or saintly interventions, but pulses from the throne directed like lashes across the veil. That when a Psyker calls on the Emperor, what answers is not divinity, but a machine. The implications are staggering. It suggests that the Emperor engineered not just a system of governance, but a metaphysical construct. A psychic dominion built from suffering, a throne not of gold but of bone and flame. And the Psyker plague? It was the ignition source, the slow-building spark he needed to power the machine across millennia. Which leads us to a horrifying possibility. The Emperor is not dying. He is transforming. The throne is not a prison. It is a chrysalis. And when it opens, if it opens, what emerges may not be the man who once walked Terra in human guise. It will be something greater. Something built from 10,000 years of sacrifice. And the Psyker plague? It was never a curse. It was the beginning. The Emperor was not merely a warlord, not just a psychic titan. He was a perpetual, a being who could not die, who had walked the earth since before recorded history, shaping the path of mankind from behind 1,000 masks. His vision stretched across millennia. His plans spanned epochs. And in this vast canvas of time, he may have done more than rule. He may have seeded the very fabric of humanity with psychic potential. There are stories, often buried, of the Emperor traveling the world in ancient times, of him guiding early civilizations, defeating warp-spawned horrors, whispering into the dreams of kings. But these were not just acts of protection. They may have been part of a genetic campaign. For what if, through his endless life, he subtly altered the gene pool of humanity? What if every child born with psychic sensitivity is not the result of random mutation, but of ancient intervention? The Emperor could have implanted psychic markers into the human genome over tens of thousands of years. Not overt powers, not full-blown psychers, but dormant traits, hidden sparks. Over time, these sparks would accumulate, spread through breeding, recombine, and ignite under the right conditions of fear, war, desperation, and proximity to the warp. The Age of Strife provided that crucible, and suddenly the Psyker plague was born. This would mean that humanity's psychic explosion was not an accident of evolution, but the flowering of a carefully nurtured seed. But why? Some say it was to prepare for chaos, to give mankind a fighting chance against the demonic. Others believe it was to make humanity the dominant psychic force in the galaxy, to eclipse the dying Eldar and rival the warp itself. But there is another, more disturbing theory, that the Emperor did not just want to protect humanity from the warp, he wanted to own it. To do that, he needed a species that could exist within the warp without being devoured. Psykers, stable, trained, numerous, a species not bound by flesh alone but capable of interacting with the soul realm on command. And to get there, he needed suffering. Death, trials, the weak would die, the unstable would burn, but those who survived would be the next phase of mankind. The Great Crusade was not the start of this plan, it was the acceleration. The unification of human worlds was necessary to centralize control over psychic development. The black ships were not a reaction, they were the harvesters. The Librarius was not an experiment, it was a prototype. And the Emperor, through it all, watched the results of his ancient work take shape. But here lies the gamble. Evolution is not predictable. The Psyker plague has created saints and monsters, prophets and heretics. For every stable astropath, there is a burning world. For every sanctioned Psyker, 1,000 fall to madness or demonic corruption. The Emperor may have intended a guided evolution, but what he created was a firestorm. Worse, he may have lost control. The Horus Heresy, the collapse of the Webway Project, the rise of chaos worship, these were not merely betrayals. They were consequences, side effects of a psychic transformation too vast to fully contain. The Emperor, for all his foresight, may have misjudged the scale of the plague he nurtured. He may have believed he could shape a godlike species, only to find that gods cannot be chained. And so we are left with a paradox. If the Emperor is a perpetual, then his patience is beyond comprehension. He may not see the Psyker plague as a crisis, but as a phase. A necessary chaos through which order will be born. 10,000 years of suffering may be to him the blink of an eye, a cost worth paying for the birth of a race that can dominate the stars and the warp alike. Or perhaps he made a mistake. Perhaps in trying to uplift mankind, he unbalanced the very nature of human existence. Perhaps the plague was not a gift, but a wound. One that will never stop bleeding. Either way, the truth is chilling. The Psyker plague is not just a mutation. It is the Emperor's legacy, carved into our DNA, roaring through our blood. It is the result of a god's dream or a perpetual's gamble. And we are the proof that it worked, or that it failed. They walk among us like ghosts wearing flesh, blanks, pariahs, untouchables. The mirror image of the Psyker. Where the Psyker burns with warp light, the blank is silence incarnate. Where Psykers hear the whispers of the warp, blanks cannot hear them at all. Worse, daemons recoil from their presence. Sorcery fizzles against their skin. Even ordinary humans instinctively feel dread near them, as if their very existence violates some sacred order. They are not simply different. They are voids in the human soulscape. And perhaps they were never meant to exist? Or perhaps they were meant to balance the scale. The pariah gene is among the most mysterious anomalies in human biology. Rare, suppressed, often exterminated at birth by horrified parents or fearful officials. And yet, it appears across vast regions of space, often in families with no history of psychic activity, and often in places saturated with warp phenomena. There's no clear genetic pathway, no simple heredity. But when it manifests, its effects are absolute. The person becomes a psychic dead zone, a null in the immaterium. That such a phenomenon even exists suggests something unnatural, something deliberate. Because for every fire, there is a fire break. If the Emperor seeded the Psyker gene, is it possible he also seeded the pariah gene? Not as a mistake, not as a mutation, but as a failsafe? A counterweight to the psychic explosion he unleashed? For if humanity was to become a race of warp-active beings, it would also need shepherds, regulators, those who could walk among the flames without being consumed. Blanks may have been designed to be these shepherds. Throughout Imperial history, blanks are hidden in the shadows. They are recruited into secretive orders, the Sisters of Silence, the Officio Assassinorum's Culexis Temple, and countless unknown operatives buried within inquisitorial black cells. These agents are not just immune to demonic corruption, they are weapons against it. A Culexis assassin can kill not with bullets, but with absence. To daemons and psychers, they are living anti-souls. But here's the disturbing twist. Blanks are just as feared by humans as they are by demons. No one wants to live near them. No one wants to speak with them. Even the most stalwart of warriors feel a sense of revulsion in their presence. It's more than discomfort, it's existential horror. A feeling that the universe has made a mistake. That this person should not be. And that, too, may be part of the design. Because what better way to keep the regulators from becoming rulers than to make them abhorrent to society? What better way to ensure they remain hidden, humble, and controlled? In this light, the Emperor's plan becomes even more chilling. He may not have just created the Psyker plague. He may have sculpted the entire spectrum of human psychic existence, from blazing telepaths to soul-dead blanks. From flaming stars to black holes, all of it designed to feed, balance, and ultimately dominate the warp. And the blanks, though reviled, may be the most important part of all. They are the keystones, the silencers, the ones who keep the warp from overflowing. Perhaps the Emperor saw that humanity, if left unchecked, would be devoured by its own power. That psychers, without contrast, would rise to madness and godhood. The blanks are the leash, the boundary, the unlovable guardians of a psychic empire. But here's the tragedy. They can never be part of what they protect. They walk alone. They are kept in isolation, feared by their peers, used by institutions that see them as tools rather than people. Their lives are sacrifice without ceremony. They are heroes in a war no one sees, and yet they are mourned by none. In the grand psychic equation of humanity, psychers are the flame, but blanks are the shape of the hearth. One cannot exist without the other. And if the Emperor truly crafted both, then his vision was not simply of a race of gods, but of a psychic ecosystem. One where power and silence exist in tension, where every soul has its mirror, where humanity becomes not a mob of raw minds, but a symphony of purpose. But at what cost? For the blanks, the price is isolation. For the psychers, the price is madness. And for humanity, the price is to live forever at war with itself. Soul against soul, silence against scream. And perhaps that, too, is the Emperor's design. Not peace, not unity, balance. Across the scorched bones of the Imperium, among the howling voids of warp-rent reality and the cracked marble of cathedrals built atop corpses, one truth endures. The Emperor casts a long shadow. Whether seen as a god, a corpse, or a monster, his legacy is inescapable. And if the Psyker plague was his creation, if he seeded it, nurtured it, unleashed it, then that shadow is not a passive absence, but an active presence. A curse, a design, a fire that consumes everything it touches, while still illuminating the stars. The Psyker plague is not simply a symptom of human evolution, nor the inevitable result of warp exposure. It is too precise, too widespread. It affects every level of society, from gutter scum mutants to noble scions. It appears on hive worlds, death worlds, pleasure worlds. No environment is immune. Even the genes of stable bloodlines are not spared. It spreads like an idea written into the genome, a virus of the soul that whispers in dreams and screams in death. But when you follow its trajectory, when you trace the rise of Psykers across the age of strife, the emergence of sanctioned Psykers, the black ships, the soul tides, the golden throne, one pattern becomes undeniable. This is not chaos. This is infrastructure. The Emperor did not react to the plague. He anticipated it, controlled it, used it. He created institutions not to halt the psychic surge, but to process it. He built temples that double as sorting facilities for the soul. He established doctrines that criminalize unregistered psychic potential, ensuring all raw power is either destroyed or absorbed into his system. He turned the warp from a wild, demonic ocean into a navigable sea by fueling his lighthouse with the lives of his people. And yet, he remained silent. 10,000 years upon the throne, and not a word, not a gesture, not a breath of explanation. Is it death? Is it slumber? Or is it calculation? There is a theory, dreaded by the ecclesiarchy, whispered in radical inquisitorial circles, that the Emperor is not simply surviving upon the throne, he is becoming. That the throne is not a tomb, but a crucible. That the Psyker plague is not a flaw, but a kindling. And that when he finally rises, he will not be a man, not even a god. He will be something new. A being sculpted by the dreams and screams of an entire species. A psychic singularity, born of suffering, sacrifice, and fire. A force that will not simply guide humanity, but replace it. A second birth, a final god. If this is true, then the Psyker plague is not a disease. It is labor, and we, the human race, are in the throes of delivering our own extinction, or our own apotheosis. Perhaps the Emperor saw that mankind could never conquer the galaxy as it was. Too fractured, too fragile, too easily swayed by Xeno's lies and demonic temptation. Perhaps he saw that only a psychic species, unified, trained, and led by one absolute will, could survive the wars to come. Perhaps he accepted the cost, chose it, designed it, and what a cost it is. Entire generations burned to ash, the minds of children broken before they can speak, planets devoured by uncontrolled warp phenomena, demons wearing the faces of mothers, pariahs forced into lonely martyrdom, sanctioned Psykers turned into tools, their humanity flayed away in service of a light they can never look upon. This is not mercy. It is not salvation. It is control. The Emperor's control. So yes, maybe he did create the Psyker plague on purpose. Maybe every scream, every black ship, every soul cast into the throne's inferno is part of his grand vision. And maybe that vision is so vast, so unthinkably cold that we cannot call it good or evil. Only inevitable. And if you've made it this far, if your soul hasn't recoiled from these heresies, these possibilities, then maybe you're ready to ask the next question. What happens when he wakes? And who will we be when he does? If this journey into the dark heart of the Imperium left your mind burning and your thoughts spiraling into the immaterium, subscribe to the channel. There's always another forbidden truth waiting to be whispered. The Emperor protects. Or perhaps he designs.